The ancient land of Israel is a testimony, an evidence of the greatness of what God did in that country, a testimony to the truth of the words that we find in the pages of the Bible. The people who lived here have left behind a record, an indelible record, if you will, of their lives. An important part of that record is the cities where they lived, ancient piles of debris that contain their culture, architecture, art, their diet, the weapons they used, and even on occasion, their writings. These piles of ancient cities, often built one on top of the other, are called tells. People in ancient times tended to build and live in the same places, maybe because there were occupations there, or a main road went nearby, or maybe, most likely of all, a source of fresh water. As archaeologists began to peel away the layers of this ancient civilization, the culture and even the people of the Bible come to light. I'd like to ask you to join us on this adventure. We're going to try and understand the people, the context of the Bible. It'll mean some extra hiking, some climbing, some travel to out-of-the-way places, but the end result, I think, will be well worth the effort as we discover again that God's Word, God's message, is as relevant for us as it was for them. The location Herod picked for the awesome fortress that he named after himself, the Herodian, is a place, an area rich in biblical history. Jacob buried his beloved Rachel just over here on the hills near Bethlehem. Sometime later, 2 women coming down out of the hills toward this area, as Naomi and Ruth came back from their time when they were away because the land had been under famine. Ruth goes down to one of the fields below and begins to glean from a farmer named Boaz. Ruth and Boaz are married and eventually become the great-great-grandparents of David. And young David becomes the newly anointed king of Israel, the one whose reign and even whose character would become the pattern for the Messiah to come. And finally, the greatest act, the greatest historical event of all, the birth of Jesus. As the sun rises and sets on the Judean mountains, the shadow of the Herodian is thrown on the small villages around, including Bethlehem itself. And somewhere within that shadow, Jesus was born. The palace fortress that Herod built here was the 3rd largest in the entire world at the time, and certainly one of the most glorious. It's divided into an upper and a lower palace, covering more than 45 acres of territory. The upper palace can be seen for miles. Around the outside, double walls about 15 feet apart, and between those 2 walls, the chambers and rooms that were necessary for all of his servants and palace staff. On each of the 4 sides of that upper fortress, a tower several stories high. In these towers were the rooms for the royal family and the government officials. And on the east, the greatest tower of all, more than 100 feet high, where Herod and his own family could live and catch the breezes from the Mediterranean on hot summer days. When one walks through the glory of this palace complex, we're struck by the great vision and the great power that was Herod. And it becomes more obvious what an act of faith it was for the Jewish people to be willing to commit to the fact that Jesus was Messiah and King.
The place is called the Herodian, built by King Herod. If you look here to the east, you can see in the distance the water of the Dead Sea. And just beyond the water, the mountains across the Dead Sea, the mountains of Moab. And then coming from the Dead Sea in this direction, you see the hills of the Judea wilderness. Notice how clearly the wilderness begins and the farmland ends. To the west of us, the Judea mountains. You can see that block of mountains not so very far away from here, almost straight across from us, the Valley of Elah. Just a little bit to our north, kind of sprawling down the hillside over here, you see the town of Bethlehem. Today a pretty large city, pretty modern city in a way. We sit then at the edge of Bethlehem, which is a frontier town. Very clear distinction between the wilderness out here, the land of the shepherd. We've seen the green pastures. David wrote about the green pastures, and if you want to see the green pastures he's talking about, you need to look to the east, because that's where the shepherd went. The shepherd wouldn't come here on the farmland, because as you can tell, there's not a lot of good farmland, so the shepherd stays out there, and the farmer goes over here. The structure we're actually sitting on takes us to the New Testament time. Herod was living and ruling in Jerusalem, but his fear, of course, was Cleopatra to the south and west. And so he had a line of escape routes that allowed him to leave Jerusalem, to come down to this area only in about 8 or 10 miles or so and to find safety. And then just beyond us, Masada, and very soon he'd be back home to where he came from, which is the country of Idumea. One of the largest palaces in the world. The whole complex itself may have been several hundred acres of area. Down below, a huge swimming pool, colonnade around it, a beautiful garden with all kinds of exotic plants. Then up on the top of this hill stands the fortress called the Herodian. You can see across the diameter of this huge open area here, and several stories still left of that glorious palace that was open to the sky.